So welcome back. Now, where we left off is how Keynes was thinking about using fiscal policy to help stabilize the economy. And basically, he felt that budget deficits and budget surpluses are just a routine feature of what we call counter-cyclical fiscal policy. Now, that's a fancy way of saying using fiscal policy to get the economy from contracting back to expanding. And so he didn't think that the goal of macroeconomic policy was to balance the budget. He felt that it was used to try to get the economy to full employment. So let's take a look at this process. So basically, the Congress is the governmental agency or entity that's in charge of spending money at the federal level, right? And each year they get together and with the president, they put together a budget for the upcoming fiscal year. And the fiscal year is not from January to December. The fiscal year is basically, it is a year, it's 12 months, but it begins October 1st for the federal government and it runs 12 months from that point. And to a large extent, current revenues and expenditures are the result of decisions made in previous budgets. And we call that mandatory spending. Mandatory spending is money that you've already allocated. Now, the remaining spending is what we call discretionary spending or discretionary fiscal spending. And that's basically the part of the budget that's not determined by past obligations. Now, since most of the budget is mandatory, that limits what the federal government can do in terms of fiscal stimulus. Now, again, most of the uncontrollable line items in the federal budget change with economic conditions. In other words, the government spending will increase when unemployment goes up because the government spends more on unemployment benefits. That's an example of what we're saying right here. And so outlays, or in other words, spending, government spending for unemployment compensation and welfare benefits increase when the economy goes into recession. Things like income transfers, those are simply payments to individuals for which no current or goods or services are exchanged. And examples of this are like what we talked about here in terms of uncontrollable line items. Things like unemployment benefits. That's simply an income transfer. I tax you and give that money to an unemployed worker, and that's an example of an income transfer. And we call these automatic stabilizers. So think about this. Think about an elevator that breaks loose from its cable. It starts to fall. Well, modern elevators have what we call automatic braking systems. It stops the elevator from falling all the way down to the ground floor. Well, when the economy starts to fall in terms of economic activity, there are brakes that keep it from falling further, and that's what we call automatic stabilizers. And we just mentioned one of them, unemployment benefits. When the economy starts to fall, unemployment goes up, but the government spends more on unemployment benefits, and that helps prevent the economy from either falling farther down or keeping the rate of fall at a slower rate. So automatic stabilizers also exist on the revenue side. So in other words, when the economy is doing well, the government takes in more money because of increased government activity, and it spends less money on things like unemployment. Now, when the government runs a deficit, it could be for one of two reasons. One, it's just spending more money regardless of what's happening to revenues, or it could be spending more money because the economy is faltering and revenues are falling. So the size of the federal deficit or surplus is sensitive to the business cycle, the expansions or contractions of the overall economy. And the actual budget deficits or surpluses may arise from economic conditions as well as policy. Now, the cyclical deficit, that's simply the part of the budget deficit that's due to an economic downturn. So when the economy's faltering and the government spends more to try to counteract it, and the government takes in less because of falling tax revenues, that deficit is called a cyclical deficit. Now, the other type of deficit is a structural deficit. That's mainly due to the fact of decisions made by the government to simply spend more money, regardless of what's happening to the overall economy. Now, there are a number of consequences that arises from budget deficits. One of them is what we call crowding out. Crowding out is when the government borrows a lot of money, it leaves less money for the private sector to borrow. So think about this. What happens when something becomes more scarce? The price of that good or service goes up. Well, the price of borrowing money is the interest rate. So if the government needs to borrow a lot of money and it leaves less loanable funds out there for the private sector, the remaining loanable funds will be scarce, therefore the interest rates will go up. If interest rates go up, private sector will borrow less. In other words, the public sector is crowding out the private sector. Now, this leads to what we call opportunity cost. An opportunity cost is simply what you have to give up to get something else. So when you make a decision, or the government makes a decision to borrow more, it has to give up something, and that something could be future private sector borrowing. So businesses may borrow less as a result of the decision for the government to borrow more today. And of course, the fact that borrowing is changing, it's going to change interest rates. So let's take a look at what happens when an economy like the United States runs a budget deficit for many years. It accumulates in the form of debt. So the United States has accumulated a large amount of debt, and the national debt is simply the accumulation of annual budget deficits. And so in order to borrow money, the government issues bonds. Basically, depending upon how long the government wants to borrow money, if it wants to borrow short term, the types of notes the government issues are called treasury bills. If it wants to borrow in the medium term, let's say 5 years, it will offer something called a treasury note. If it wants to borrow long term, let's say for 10 years or 30 years, we call those treasury bonds. So bills, notes, and bonds are all the same thing in terms of it's the government borrowing money from whomever is willing to loan it money, and it issues them an IOU in the form of a treasury bill, treasury note, or treasury bond. Now, the greatest increase in debt that the United States witnessed was during World War II. And so rather than raise taxes, the government simply rationed consumer goods, and it encouraged Americans to loan the government money in the issue of war bonds. Now, in the 1980s, the national debt rose by $2 trillion. Now, what's interesting is this was not related to any war. There was no war in the 1980s. But there were two significant recessions at the start of the 1980s, and that caused the cyclical deficits to increase. And there was basically a big military buildup. The Cold War heated up during the 1980s, and that caused a lot more government spending, and that resulted in more deficits and larger debt. Now, in the 1990s, that trend in the 1980s continued, And but towards the end of the 1990s, we did manage to run some budget surpluses, so the national debt contracted somewhat. And that's what we see here. But after the 1990s and the 2000s, the deficits continued, and so the debt started to accumulate. And that's what we see here. So by 2002, the accumulated debt was $5.6 trillion. And now if you take that $5.6 trillion and divide it by the population at the time, that worked out $20,000 for every American citizen. And by 2005, the debt surpassed $8 trillion. And now currently the national debt is close to $20 trillion. And you could see here the rise and fall of the debt. So you could see here during, let me see if I can get my pen to work. There, I got my pen back. So you could see that during times of war, let's say like the Civil War, the government needs money for the war effort, so it borrows a lot, and so you could see the national debt picks up a lot. The same thing happened during World War I, right? And to a great extent, it happened during World War II. But then we started to see peacetime expansions of the deficit, which is unusual from historic purposes. Now, when we loan money, who do we loan that money to? Or in other words, who owns the debt? Well, the national debt creates as much wealth as liabilities for the Treasury, right? And federal agencies, other parts of the government, own the government money. So in other words, 42% of the debt is owned by other parts of the government, like Social Security. Social Security has run a budget surplus for quite some time. Now, it's not going to keep that surplus in the form of cash. So what it does is it takes that surplus of dollars and it simply invests it in treasury bonds. And those treasury bonds are simply from the federal government needing money. So it's a weird way of saying that the government owes money to the government. And that same goes for state and local governments. Some of the state and local governments hold some of their surpluses in the form of U.S. federal debt. And there are also private investors in the United States who buy U.S. government debt. If you have a 401k, you may be investing in U.S. government bonds, and so that means you are a private investor in U.S. government debt. Now, the remaining 33% is owned by foreigners, foreign governments, or foreign investors. So you could see most of the debt is held by Americans in some fashion. And you can see this in a nice pie chart. So this right here is the portion owned by the U.S. government, right? Or U.S. citizens or government. And the rest is foreign owned. And so that's all we have. So I want you to see the connection between the last chapter, fiscal policy, and the previous chapters in terms of the business cycle and aggregate demand, and see how when we use fiscal policy to stimulate the economy, that requires the government in most cases to borrow money when it's using government spending to stimulate the economy. When they borrow money, you run a budget deficit. Those deficits accumulate into debt, and that debt at some point will have to be repaid.